All right, guys. Well, we are just at time, and I want to begin as close or on time as much as I can this morning because, as I mentioned in previous classes, but I think this time I mean it a little bit more. We have a lot to cover, and so I want us to use our time as best as we possibly can. So let me just have a quick introduction here. We're in class number 7 in our church history Reformation Beyond class. We've looked at Luther, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, Calvin, Reformation in Great Britain, and I think maybe one class in between there is an introduction to Luther, but that's what we've covered so far. If you want to find those videos, they're posted on our YouTube page. Today, I'm not even really sure. It sort of depends on how much we're able to cover today, what my title would be. We're going to look at Europe, Greater Europe, and the expansion of the Reformation, Germany and beyond, France, hopefully this morning. So we got a lot to look at. It'll be similar to last class's format as we look at the monarchy and various groups of Protestants, but we probably won't get into individual names too much for the Reformation here today. So let's get right to it. I want to pray, and that's how we'll start this morning, and then we can go from there into our material. So let's bow our heads and ask for the Lord's blessing. Father, as we begin another study of church history this morning, we ask you for your blessing on our class as we continue to examine these dates and peoples and rulers. We see it's so apparent your governing hand over all of these events, even some very difficult, some very tragic, but yet used, Lord, of you to bring about great movements and advancements of your kingdom. I ask, God, that you would cause this to be a deep encouragement for us this morning. Help us to cover lots in a shorter period of time. And Lord, may we come from here encouraged and blessed, ready to worship. In your name, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. So we're going to start with Germany this morning. We're going to come back all the way to Germany where we began our study of church history. Then I want to look maybe if we can more of the Scandinavian Reformation a little bit. And then Lower Europe. We're going to look if we can on Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. At least those are their modern understandings. They were a conglomerate of provinces back in this time. And then I really want to get to France. So we're going to move a little faster if I can in the beginning, Germany and Low Europe, and then try to get to France and use the most of our time on France, okay? So let's come back to Germany. Again, you remember the German reformer Martin Luther, the opposition of Emperor Charles V. So these are some of the names you want to have in the back of your brain. And again, you'll have to use your focus because I'm going to go a little bit faster this morning. You'll remember some language. And if you don't remember all of it, maybe use YouTube to go back to those previous classes and do some research on the language. The Peace of Nuremberg. This was a peace that was established that gave freedom to the Protestants, quite a bit of freedom. And and again, we're looking back at that time period, Martin Luther is still alive, the Protestantism is flourishing in Germany. The Peace of Nuremberg was established, but despite limitations, and the Peace of Nuremberg did put limitations on Protestantism. It allowed them the freedom to worship, but not to expand Protestantism throughout the regions of Germany. That couldn't be hindered. I think Charles V knew that, and Protestantism continued to flourish despite that agreement. Emperor Charles V, just due to providential circumstances, was hindered from opposing the Protestant Reformation. Sort of had his hands tied once again based on the circumstances. There are Protestant men in power. This is highly strong influence on the Protestant Reformation in Germany. There was a league of Protestants that were highly influential called the League of Schmalkalden. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Again, I say that lots during this class, but I'm doing my best. The League of Schmalkalden. This was a great supporter of the Reformation, with many notable leaders, including Martin Luther. And Charles V, knowing that he couldn't really push back on the Protestants too much, lest he bring about a war he didn't have the support to create, decided a more diplomatic approach to opposing Protestantism by creating a counter league, or encouraging a Catholic counter league to oppose them, called the Nuremberg League. So another Catholic league to come and push against Protestantism. However, even among Catholics, there was hesitancy to Charles's power. This is just another contributing factor that tied the hands of the Emperor Charles from pushing back on Protestantism like he would like to have. Catholics were hesitant that his house had a growing amount of power that was substantially subsuming the Catholic power as well, growing far more than they could control themselves. So he had enemies from all camps. A little bit more maybe of some contributing factors that tied the hands of Charles V was the death of Catholic leaders prominent in opposing the Reformation. Not assassination, just death. And you could tell that Protestantism, whether it's the League of Schmalkalden, the support amongst various leaders, that Protestantism was looking to take over Germany. There was a point in this time period where there were so many Protestant leaders that there were more Protestant leaders, Protestant nobility at this time, that would even overwhelm the numbers of Catholics who would then decide the next emperor. So you could tell Protestantism was growing to a point where it would be influential to the highest powers of nations. So this was a problem for Charles V and certainly for Catholics. Although there were some hindrances to Protestantism at that time, a few blows, if you will, to the growth of the Reformation. The leader of the Schmalkalden League, named Philip of Hesse, had a bit of a morality problem. He was married, but he struggled with promiscuity, and this really put a bad name on Protestantism and the Reformation. He would end up secretly taking another wife, and that would not remain secret and would become a scandal for the Schmalkalden League. And so you had that as a massive hindrance to the Reformation. There was a duke named Maurice who was denied his position for various reasons on the Schmalkalden League, and that obviously created a bit of difficulty in his mind for his support of the Reformation. And Charles V, the emperor, sort of offered him a better deal for his support of his control. And so Duke Maurice, a previous Protestant, turned and supported Charles V, which was a betrayal that hurt the Reformation. And then you have Luther's death. Luther's death, even though Luther at this time didn't have the massive support that he did before because of his stance against the peasant rebellions, he took a position that said that the civil magistrate should actually oppose by violence the peasant rebellions, and that really discolored him from certain groups of Protestantism, although we would probably in part agree with his view here. Luther's death, obviously there was no more head, there was no more real leadership support of the Protestant Reformation, and Charles V took advantage of this. Here you go. Here's his opportunity finally to squash, if he can, Protestantism, and so he invades Germany and he opposes Protestantism by force. But he really can only oppose Protestantism by force to an extent, because he still doesn't have the support of the people. If he does full-scale war, he's going to end his rule. So despite his invasion, Protestantism still has more control than Charles could overthrow. And so his approach has to be diplomatic. It has to be incremental instead of by violence or even persecution to a certain degree. He is forced to use diplomatic measures via what was known as the Augsburg Interim. This is a peace treaty, as it were, sort of an agreement between Catholics and Protestants. Can we have common ground? Can we agree on the essentials, as it were? Buying time for himself to bring out further steps. He did still plan to persecute reformers, but this would give him a little bit of time, stop maybe quell a little bit of that lack of support and gain more trust before he could implement what he really wanted to do. But this didn't get the support that he wanted. Even with the Augsburg interim, it wasn't fully agreed upon. Even Catholics began to conspire against Charles V. France would side against Charles, again, his mortal enemy in France, and he would actually have to flee. He just didn't get the support he wanted to get by this interim. Catholics and Protestants didn't really want to agree for the most part. He should have predicted that. And so he would have to flee, and even eventually he was opposed to such a degree he would relinquish all his power to his brother, Ferdinand II. And Ferdinand II was very tolerant to Protestantism. So he essentially, I believe, Charles V actually ended up retiring to a monastery. He just hid from the public eye, still lived in pomp and circumstance, but just became a counselor to his brother, sort of just defeated in his rule, which I believe is something of the judgment of God. Just a little bit about the Scandinavian Reformation. Just checking my time here. Scandinavian Reformation really flourished by comparison to the German Reformation. We'd say that the German Reformation still did flourish, but the Scandinavian Reformation had much more support from the kings. Almost immediately, in some sense, there was far more an adoption of higher powers than there was in Germany, where it was more of a people's Reformation. In the Scandinavian Reformation, it grew top down. It flourished in the monarchy, where the monarchy had support, a lot more anyway. Christian II was in power at the time of the German Reformation, and his bad rulership set the stage for his successor, who was Frederick I. So that's probably more the important name for us. Frederick I, who consolidated power over Denmark and Norway as well. And Frederick I would be far more convinced of the importance, or at least political advantageousness, of the Reformation. And so he would grant free rein to Protestantism. And he would set the stage for his successor, who was Christian III. And Christian III was a convinced Lutheran. I think he even sat on various councils with Luther, a vocal supporter. So now you have great Scandinavian Protestant freedom as the ruler is a Lutheran by conviction. This is very rare. He's one who is full-blown reformer, and so supports it among the people. Dwindling Catholic support. There's also another Swedish king. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about him just for time's sake, but a Swedish king, Gustavus Vasa. He wasn't necessarily a convicted Protestant, but he created a lot of strength in the Reformation because he was sort of a revolutionary. He came to his kingly power via revolution. But to overthrow Catholic power, he pit them against each other and sided with Protestantism because he's seen a lot of problems in Catholic power. So this, again, created much freedom for Protestantism. You have by 1560, okay, this is early for Scandinavian rule. Sweden was thoroughly Protestant. Okay, 1560 is just really incredible when you compare that to the wars and the back and forth, the fights that take place in other areas. 1560 is a quick Reformation. Sweden was thoroughly Protestant. Ooh, let's see how fast I can go. Okay, that was already 15 minutes. I don't know. I'm going to try to get into Low Europe. I might have to cut it off. We'll see. Advance of the Reformation in Low Europe. This is going to be brief, if I can. The Reformation across Europe, specifically in the lower regions. Then it was called the 16 provinces. Now we know it as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Okay, so those are modern, but back then there were 17 provinces, so a lot more different rulership in different provinces and regions. So this is again under Charles V, so there's that name again in his rule. So we got to back up our time a little bit. There's a great lack of political and cultural unity in this region, even though this is where Charles V actually hails from. So this is his home region. He speaks the same language. He has a lot more support in these provinces. But there's a lot of disunity still. Even though they like their ruler, there's a lot of disunity amongst themselves. And Charles V, sort of from here on, made sort of a bad decision here, placing these provinces under the rule of his son Philip in 1555. Philip comes from Spain. He has Spanish Spain is in his blood. This is not the language of the people. They are already disunified culturally, and Philip's entrance into power over these provinces only hurts that unity. It provokes resentment. So Philip is in power in 1555, not liked. Zooming out from this power control of Philip, though, Protestantism is making waves in these areas, these 17 provinces. Remember, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They're influenced by humanism. Again, that study of ancient literature that opens up the doorway to go back to the original languages of Scripture. You have Lutherans, Anabaptists, who are already entered in. Melchior Hoffman, you might remember that name when we did the Anabaptist class, has a great influence. And there's an influx even of Calvinistic preachers. So again, from Calvin and his seminary, there's lots of preachers and churches being established here. Protestantism becomes very successful. Charles V attempts to stamp it out here. Okay, he still has power. He makes very many cruel edicts against this people. But Philip, when he came into power, he made it even worse. He was far more influenced, obviously, by Spain, and so he brings in Spanish soldiers, not necessarily to bring about a war, but just bring them in, which, again, quells up a lot of lack of support and worry. And also, Philip has his own sort of Inquisition-type bishops. So again, you bring in sort of this torturous method to stop and squash Protestantism under Philip. It just makes things rough. The response: magistrates of the provinces oppose these measures. There's not an acceptance. They see this as a problem. They see this as hindering the provinces. William of Orange, very important name. I wish we had more time to talk about him this morning, but William of Orange, he is one of the most notable advisors to the king, and he will be even more a main advocate of Protestantism. He would become their great name of defense, but he's not necessarily totally for that at the moment. He's a king's advisor, but he sees and predicts Philip's opposition and his false sympathy to Protestantism, his desire to squash it and create great problems. And so he is in the background trying to convince an armed resistance with the counts, so other nobility as well. I'm sorry, we're rushing really quick through this, but bloody battles essentially ensue between Philip, under Philip's rule, the Duke of Alba. It's just, again, Philip bringing about great battles. He's got all these Spanish soldiers, and they're bringing in Spanish troops now to invade and fight, and William counterattacks, now fighting back. He made advances on the sea, but under Philip, Philip brings a reign of terror against Protestantism in these provinces. Under the control of his military commander, Alba, he creates something called the Council of Blood, which is essentially a council, a judicial system, not based upon any law, in essence, actually given the freedom to form their own law, based upon Philip's determination that, well, we just can't operate within the confines of law. We just need to get rid of these Protestants. And so it was known at this time for Protestants to come with no trial, just the basis of intuition, and be put to death. There were so many deaths, so many Protestant murders at this time out of this council of blood, that it was said you could smell the stench of dead bodies in the streets. They were running out of places to put them. It was just an awful, awful opposition to Protestantism. Eventually, the people begin to despise this, and so Alba sort of quits from his position as military leader. There's another military leader under Philip, Louis Requesens. He again makes various advances, but he will die. And his army at this point, and again, the stage was already set for this kind of anarchy. His army just runs out of control. Their military leader under Philip dies, and the Spanish powers are sacking provinces, and they're killing random people, they're slaughtering Protestants on any basis, and eventually you come to a point where there needs to be intervention. And the powers agree on something called the Pacification of Ghent. This is an alliance of the provinces, so sort of a counterattack. Sorry, I might have said that wrong. The Pacification of Ghent was an agreement amongst the Protestant magistrates against these powers, against these controls and implements of Philip. And this was an agreement that William Orange very much supported. Unfortunately, even though there was a agreement, pacification of Ghent, battles would go on for a long time in this region. Philip would invade again, but Philip would fail to conquer the northern provinces. And that's significant because that would end up being a stronghold for Protestantism in these regions. The southern would be more devoted to Catholicism. William of Orange would eventually be assassinated, unfortunately. But I want to conclude here to get into France. By 1607, after the death of Philip II, Spain, just and tired of this ongoing war, relentless slaughter, pulled out from the war, and a truce was officially signed. The vast majority, again, at this time of the North was Protestant and Calvinistic. This would eventually become their national identity. And these religious convictions would contribute to the future formation of these three countries. So you have the Netherlands being Protestant as a result, majority Protestant, and Catholicism in Belgium and Luxembourg. So I know that's really fast, fire hose type of overview, but maybe if you missed it, you'll want to go back and listen to that video really quick. So I come now, great, we have a little bit more time. Reformation in France, okay? This is where we're going to spend most of our time today. So hopefully, slow down a little bit. Reformation in France. This one, if you thought the last one, Low Europe, was tumultuous, well, you better prepare for this one. This is an area in which there is the greatest sort of presence of religious wars between Protestants. Maybe that could be argued in other regions too, but the greatest presence of religious wars between Catholicism and Protestantism. Just battle back and forth, fight. This is the area where it's known as the religious wars, which ultimately end in Protestant advancement, surely, but just a lot of difficulty. So let's talk a little bit about politics and power first in France. At the Reformation start, France was ruled by Francis I. There's a lot of Francis's names, so I feel bad sort of saying that because sometimes we get lost. Well, actually, you're going to hear the name Henry probably more than you've ever heard the name Henry this morning. We'll talk about it later, the Battle of the Three Henrys. We'll get there, but anyway, hopefully you can follow along. Francis I. So he's in control in France during the time the Reformation is beginning to advance. Not in support of Protestantism, generally speaking, but he supports it in Germany because where the rule of Germany is under Charles V, his mortal enemy. So he supports Protestantism so long as it stays in Germany and it doesn't come to France because it hinders his enemy. He doesn't have unity of where his rule is, his citizenship. And so this creates a unique opportunity for the Reformation and Protestants in France. Their leader, Francis, is a little bit back and forth, right? He supports the Protestantism over there, so he's a little bit lenient, but in his own area of rule, his own dominion, he's opposed to it. So his attitude shifts, and this gives freedoms. Protestantism advances, and uniquely among the scholarly region of people, nobility, the learned, especially France, Paris is known as areas of great learning, the university there, and humanistic studies, where there's a humanistic emphasis in France. And so you have amongst the scholarly, amongst the higher ups, an acceptance of Protestantism and a growth, mainly in France in particular. However, being that Francis I is not in support of Protestantism, he goes back and forth, and at other times there's persecution. And we see that persecution when we study John Calvin, because he was actually exiled as a result of Francis I's opposition to Protestantism. So, and you see that even in Geneva, there's quite a few under, is it Geneva? No, it's not Geneva. I'm forgetting at the moment. My apologies. The other location where there was far more freedom for John Calvin to be a pastor. He was a pastor of French exiles, French refugees, essentially. And those French refugees came from these regions as a result. So there was persecution. However, there was power in support of Protestantism as we consider France, because Francis's sister, Margaret of Angoulême, she married King Henry of Navarre. It's a notable name. But Margaret, Francis's sister, encouraged the Reformation. She was supportive of the Reformation. She encouraged Protestantism. She was a scholarly woman. She was a well-read woman. She ruled in Navarre, obviously where Henry is from, and that's between France and Spain. And because of the freedom of the Reformation there in Navarre, you have a lot of Protestant resources, a lot of Protestant books and tracts and writings smuggled out from this region into larger areas of Europe. So this is a safe zone under Margaret, Francis I's sister. Interesting dynamic maybe at the family dinner table, perhaps, as Francis is not in support. So you have then Francis I's death. Okay, so he dies, and his son Henry II comes and rules. So Francis I has died, Henry II comes into rule. He is worse in his opposition to Protestants. He's not so back and forth. He's not so diplomatic, trying to counterattack his enemies. He is just more overt. However, despite Henry II, opposition still against Protestantism isn't as vehement as it is in other regions or other places in Europe. And so Protestantism still flourishes to a certain degree. This is a time when, under some of the standards and writings set out by John Calvin, the very first formally organized Protestant church is actually instituted at this time. And then you have actually a synod formed and a confession of faith. So despite Henry II's opposition to Protestantism, it's just not enough to quell or stop or hinder the advancement of the Reformation. But Henry II's rule is very short. He dies only 12 years into his reign. He's still a relatively young man, and interestingly enough, he was a very sportsman-like figure. He was highly committed to his practice of jousting, and that's how he died. He died while he was in a jousting tournament where his opposer actually jousted, and he was stabbed in the eye, and he would die of his wounds shortly after. And this obviously created an opportunity for those in succession. But more than that, a bit of a fight for power, as his sons were quite young. So he leaves. Henry II dies in a jousting tournament, and he leaves his sons, who will be Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. We're going to go through those, so you don't have to remember those names right now. He's got 3 sons, and he's got 3 daughters. I'm not going to name all the daughters, but the most notable daughter is Margaret of Valois, and we're going to talk about her in a little bit. And he's got a wife, who's probably the most important name to remember at this point, Henry II's widowed wife, Catherine de Medici. And this is a woman who's very ambitious for power. Very ambitious woman who's sort of controlling and manipulating her sons for greater advances of power in their family name. But you have at this time in France a bit of a fight between nobility and powers, because you have the main monarchy, which is under Henry, who just died, and his sons. You have this family, but you also have nobility, two other very notable families of nobility who are very influential around the throne. You have a nobility family called the House of Guise, okay? Very important family to note, okay? So let's put them in three categories for a moment this morning. So you have the main monarchy family under Henry, okay? They're the kingship. But then you have a family of nobility called the family of Guise, the Dukes of Guise. This is Catholic nobility, Catholic power. They are vehemently Catholic. And then over here, outside the monarchy, you have another bloodline, and we're going to talk about what they were called. They were called the Princes of Blood, which doesn't mean they slaughter people or anything like that. They're just the princes related to another descendant from the throne. And over here, the Princes of Blood, though not directly inheriting the throne, are Protestant. Okay? Protestant princes. We're going to talk about their names in a moment. So, monarchy, House of Guise, Catholic, and princes, Protestant. They're all going to kind of fight with each other a little bit. There's going to be a lot of strife. So the House of Guise, they exercise great influence over the throne, especially in previous kings. Francis of Guise and brother Charles, his brother Charles. So these are two names, Francis and Charles of Guise. They were main advisors to Francis I. Remember, the last king that died was Henry II. That's his dad, Francis I. So the family of Guise were very close in power. They were very influential. They were main advisors to Francis I. They've got lots of power. And Francis II, who's the son, so he's coming into power, the son of Henry II, who died in the jousting tournament, the first and eldest son, Francis II. He's a bad king. Okay, horrible ruler, horrible leader, not a great leader, very young, immature, not wise. And the Guise, this Catholic family, are able to exert a lot of influence over Francis II, who's not a very good king. Still a lot of power. And over here, the Princes of Blood resent that relationship the Guise family has to the monarchy because they're Protestant. They're the closest relatives to the king too, so they should technically have the most support in advising. They should have the most influence over the king. And obviously, as I mentioned, the Guise family are committed Catholics, and the Princes of Blood are Protestants. You have some names, okay? Let's look at some names in the Princes of Blood. Antoine de Bourbon, maybe Bourbon, I don't know. Antoine de Bourbon and his brother Louis de Conde, okay? Antoine, Louis. Antoine married Jane d'Albert, daughter of Margaret of Navarre. Remember that name, Margaret of Navarre, Protestant supporter, okay? Margaret of Navarre, and she was married to Henry of Neville, I think, and she was, again, Protestant, for Protestantism, sister of Francis I. So, Antoine, house over here of the Princes of Blood, he marries Jane d'Albert, daughter of Margaret de Navarre, the Protestant, and Jane is a devoted Calvinist, okay? So she's as Protestant as they come. Very supportive of the Reformation. And Antoine and Louis, Antoine her husband, and Louis his brother, follow suit. They're Protestant reformers. So they're convinced of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. It's really almost apparent that they weren't true Christians. We're going to see that later. There's probably some debate out there about that, but we're going to see these men, particularly one in particular, just jump back and forth between Catholicism and Protestant Reformation, depending on what's advantageous for him. 6 times, actually. So hold on. We're going to look at that. So over here, Princes of Blood, again, Antoine, Louis, these men are committed to the Protestantism and Protestant Reformation. And this leads, all this difficulty within these control, this leadership, leads to the conspiracy of Amboise. Amboise? Yeesh. Let the conspiracy of Amboise. I'm just going to go with what I know, maybe my pronunciation. This conspiracy of Amboise, that's probably how you pronounce it, was a plot by the Huguenots. And again, I'm sorry to kind of do side notes here, but Huguenots, very important group. Huguenots are essentially French Protestants, French Calvinists. Okay? So that group of Protestant reformers in France now has a title. They're called the French Huguenots, Huguenots, if you will. These are French Calvinists, French Protestants, and there's a plot by them, because they recognize this fight and power, to liberate the king from the influence of the Guise. So the people, the group of Christians, essentially, are going to take matters into their hands. They're going to liberate the king. The king at that time, as well, I'm just going to mention the name. I don't want to get lost. Francis II. They're going to liberate Francis II from the influence of the Guise. They're going to seek to arrest the Duke of Guise, imprison him. But this is discovered and ends up actually putting Louis over here in the Princes of Blood. He's involved in it. Okay? So over here, there's some Princes of Blood involved in this. They're going to just imprison this man, and probably rightly so. I mean, they had an improper influence upon the king. It's discovered, and unfortunately, Louis is imprisoned. Remember, Francis II, not a good king. Francis II dies shortly after this conspiracy. And Catherine, the mother, remember, very vying for power, very controlling. Catherine takes the position of regent. She's filling in the kingship for her 10-year-old grandson, Charles IX. He's just not old enough yet. Okay, so Catherine is in the position of control. And this is good, at least for now. Catherine is able to secure power away from the Guise, because Catherine also she's a little wiser than her previous son, Francis II. She's seen the negativity of the Guise influence and the rising power the Guise family had over the kingship. And so she wants their power out too. She wants power, essentially. She wants power and control. It's not going to be necessarily advantageous for the Protestants' future, but at least for now, it is. So she's going to kick the Guise out of there, as it were, for political reasons of power for her line. She frees Louis of the Princes of Blood from prison. Okay, she frees him and limits the power of the House of Lorraine. Again, that's just another word for the Guise family, the House of the Guises. She limits their power, and she even joins with the Huguenots. So she gives them freedom at this point. And at this point, there are thousands and thousands of Huguenot churches. Protestant prisoners are freed as well. Protestant preachers, they're brought out of prison under Catherine's regency. There's a colloquy of between Protestants and Catholics. There's something called the Edict of Saint Germain. This is probably the most notable edict, and this gave freedom to the Huguenots to worship. They had to worship outside the city still, and they had to worship at daytime, and they couldn't worship with arms, so they couldn't bear arms while they were going to church. And that just goes to say that a lot of French Calvinists, French Protestant believers, they brought their guns to church. They brought their weapons to defend themselves. That's probably a class all by itself. But nonetheless, an important thing to consider. Catherine was still threatened by Huguenot power. She knew that Protestantism was still a power that was not to be trifled with. She wanted to put them in their place, but she also didn't want their influence to grow to a certain extent that would threaten her. She still looks at those princes and kind of is a little hesitant from their power. She wants her family to be in power, okay? But again, this is positive for the Reformation. So the edict is issued. Huguenots are given freedom to worship, and she wants to gain their favor, still limits them, but she, in a sense, wants to pit them against the House of Guise. That's why she gives them a little bit of freedom. There's a diplomatic solution here. It's very political. She doesn't like Guise. She knows the Guise are Catholic, and so giving more freedom to the Huguenots is going to put a lot of pressure on the Guise family. It's going to make them not liked or appreciated. And that ultimately is going to secure more power for her throne. And that way she doesn't look like the bad guy. She sort of pits these different groups together to fight each other. However, This is not well received by the House of Lorraine, or the Guise men. 2 months after this edict of Saint Germain, the Guise brothers take matters into their own hand. They must believe that they still have enough power and influence over the French to be able to do this. But the Guise brothers and 200 noblemen go and commit what would later be known as the Massacre of Vassy. The Massacre of Vassy. 200 noblemen and these Guise men, they slay hundreds of Huguenot worshiping in the village of Vassy. They just go out and they kill all the Protestants they could find. They slaughter Huguenots. It is just an awful slaughter. It's a senseless slaughter. It's a wicked slaughter from these Guise family who just go and kill as many Protestants as they can in this village, decimate them. And it begins a long series of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. And I'm not necessarily speaking to the negativity of the Protestants' ability to take up arms and fight for themselves. Just saying, lots of religious wars came about as a result of this. And so much tension and so much fighting at this point in defense that the tensions would rise and the fighting would rise to such a degree that the Catholics, under the Guise, the Duke of Guise's support, they raise up an army. And the Protestants raise up an army as well. So the Duke of Guise is leading the army of the Catholics and fighting, and Protestants put their forces under Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Okay, I think I said that decent. Pretty good. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. So you have the leader of the Protestant fighting groups, the Admiral Coligny, and you have the Duke of Guise leading the Catholic fights. Fighting and killing, going back and forth because of the massacre that led to this. Eventually, there's a truce that's agreed to a year later. So it's just the fighting lasted for a year, but still there are armies fighting each other now. A truce is agreed to. It gives the Huguenots a little bit of freedom again. But that doesn't last for very long. There are 2 more wars that take place over the course of a few years. One in 1567, a great religious war between Catholics and Protestants, and then again in 1570 that leads to finally something called the Peace of 1570. So again, another truce. They agree no more fighting, but things are going to get worse again before they get better. The Peace of 1570 chills everything out and things are looking up. Catherine, again, regent, the mother, is charitable to Protestants. It's interesting that as you consider this, you might be asking, where was she throughout all this? Like, where's Catherine? Where's her influence while the Protestants and Catholics are fighting? But the monarchy is not really devoted to things of the civil matters. They're really devoted to taxation and policies, whereas you had a lot of these ruling nobility or other sideline families that did most of the engagements on matters of justice. So it's not really a surprise that when we consider Catherine's influence that she's still over all, but she may not have her hands, necessarily in some of these matters. But nonetheless, she does, because her kingdom is threatened as a result here. Catherine, again, is charitable to the Protestants, the Huguenots, and wants them again to help her against the Guise family. Again, the Guises are a force to be reckoned with here. And at this point, 1570, a little bit after that, Coligny, remember the Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, leader of the Protestant fight, not necessarily initially looked upon positively by the monarchy under Catherine's regency, but he grows in favor with the king, her son, who is obviously now at an age where he is ruling, and I think that's Charles IX. He likes him, meets the admiral in court, and wins, is totally won over, essentially, by this admiral of the Protestant armies. And so great leniency, again, is granted to Protestants as a result. And there are efforts to form ties between the parties through, again, as we looked at weeks prior, the importance of marriage. So there are plans. So Coligny is accepted. He's liked. This leader of the Protestant armies is appreciated by the king. And so there are plans for a marriage of Catherine's daughter. Now, here we go back. There's Henry II had 3 daughters, but here Margaret Valois is the one daughter who is going to be married to the Protestant prince Henry Bourbon, who is Antoine's son. So we had a Henry and then we had a Louis. Louis Antoine's son, Henry Bourbon. So again, from that Protestant prince lineage, marrying into the monarchy now this time, Margaret Valois. Ooh, this is pretty positive for the Protestant Reformation. This gives a lot of confidence to the Huguenots, who at this part, okay, our admiral's being accepted. There's a marriage between the monarchy and the princes of blood that are supportive of the Reformation. How could it get any better? I mean, things are looking up for us. Maybe no more religious wars, right? They almost get overconfident, the Huguenots, at this point. They freely appear at court. They're highly invested in all matters of civil life. But there are problems brewing in the background that they don't see. That's going to lead to more wars in the future. The new Duke of Guise. Remember that family? The new Duke of Guise, with the previous Duke having been killed in those battles. Henry, Duke of Guise. He's angry about the death of his father in those wars. He's angry at Coligny, the admiral of the Protestant Reformation, who likely ordered the death of his own father. He's angry against the Protestant, the growing of the Protestant Reformation. And Catherine's not so happy either. Catherine is quietly concerned about the prominence of this admiral of the Protestant armies gaining influence. And a plot is developing in the background now, where it looks like the parties are merging when in reality they're breaking apart at the hinges. There is an assassination attempt on the Admiral Coligny, and it is at the wedding, actually, of Henry and Margaret. At the wedding, there is an assassination attempt of this admiral. It's sort of out in public, not expecting that this is going to happen at all. Sort of the Huguenots are there too, not expecting that anything's going to happen. And at the wedding, the shots are fired at Admiral Coligny, who I believe lost a finger and maybe I think he got shot in the leg as well. He didn't die, but he was wounded mortally. So he's bedridden, wounded mortally. And the Huguenots are really sort of upset about this, and they've already been in the courts. They've been influential. They demand justice of Charles IX, who at least initially seems to grant them some level of support. This is an outrage, of course. Well, what's going on here? And in his investigation, Charles IX finds that the gun that was actually used to seek the assassination of the admiral belonged to the Duke of Guise. So the gun belongs to him, and the horse that was used for the assassinator to flee on comes from Catherine's stables. So it's not looking very good. It's really, really not looking very good. Again, this plot is coming out that there's a conspiracy here. And this leads to what would be known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Even worse. You thought the previous massacre was bad. This gets even worse. Catherine, stewing about her issue with the influence growing now of Protestantism and the admiral and the issue of this and the threat for the throne, she convinced Charles IX, her son, that there is a Huguenot plot to take the throne. She said, there's an assassination or something going on, and she convinced her son that a horrible plot, and again, her sons don't have a very great track record for leading very well. These are bad kings. And so horrible measures would be decided upon on the evening of August 23rd. I just realized my time is already spent, so I better whip it up here, go faster. Maybe we'll have to talk about this next class, but nonetheless, I want to polish this off. August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, the Duke of Guise instructed, remember, the Duke of Guise, his son now, the systematic killing of all major Huguenots. They're just going to slaughter them all. And that's on St. Bartholomew's Day. Coligny's first in line. The Duke of Guise, they go for him with soldiers. He's pulled out of his bed chamber. He's thrown from his window down out of his building. When he falls to the ground, it is the Duke of Guise who kicks him to death, slaughters him. There are so many Bourbon guards that are killed. Remember the House of Bourbon here over on the Protestant side, the Princes of Blood. So many Bourbon guards are killed that blood runs down the stairs of the Louvre. There's massive slaughter. The Princes of Blood, remember those names? Henry Bourbon, that's Charles's brother-in-law, just married, right? Charles's brother-in-law, Henry Bourbon, over here in the Prince of Blood, that was just married to Margaret, or maybe a different name there. We'll have to go back, but I've got to finish, sorry. And Louis de Conde are brought before the king to deny their faith to save their lives. So even them, they're threatened with execution, and things only escalate. And you find here, again, they deny their faith to save their lives. They deny Protestantism to save themselves, and things escalate. Maybe we're going to cut it off here pretty quick, okay, guys, so that we can finish here because we're 5 minutes past. Maybe next class we'll get to the War of Three Henrys. But the Duke of Guise, okay, he just takes matters up a notch. He gives orders that all Protestant leaders be executed in other provinces. So he tells the magistrates they actually need to execute these Huguenots and Protestant leaders. Some of the magistrates refuse to do so because we're not murderers. We're not going to take matters in our own hands, which is an incredible teaching on the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, right? The refusal of the king's orders when they're unjust. But many magistrates do obey, and they kill many Protestants. Mobs take it into their own hands. They go far beyond that. They raid Protestant homes, kill women and children and families. It's a massive slaughter. Tens of thousands of Huguenot and Protestant victims, all killed and slaughtered during this time. And they're chaos for years. Because now, okay, the fights are back on again, right? Huguenots are back in battle. Protestants take to arms. They organize themselves to fight from the cities where they're stronger in their strongholds. Many Catholics even side with the Huguenots because they're sick and tired of bloodshed. And Charles IX, horrible ruler, horrible king. He rules until his death in 1574, but it's just a mess under his rulership, just constant battles. And in his death in 1574, the crown is passed to Henry of Anjou. That'd be Henry III, the third of the brothers there, who he was one of the authors of the previous massacre, so he had his hand in it. But he's in Poland, and he rushes from Poland to Paris to claim the French throne because he knows that I have an opportunity for power. But he sees a little bit more the political advantage and supports Protestantism to a certain degree, thinking it's to his benefit. But again, just like his brothers vacillating, he eventually bends. And when the Spanish come to war on the Huguenots, he bends to them and agrees with it, with the Duke of Guise. The country is eventually bled dry. Little is solved. Protestantism still spreads, but the Catholicism couldn't be defeated on the other side. So next week, we're going to come back and we're going to finish off this class in the French. We're going to talk about the War of Three Henrys politically and how it ended for the advancement of the Protestantism through the Huguenots. So let's end with a quick word of prayer, brothers and sisters, and then we'll open up the doors.